Nobody prepares you for the moment you realize your marriage has been competing with a ghost the entire time. My name is Nathan Walker, and for 11 years I believed I had built a good life. Not a perfect life. Those do not exist. But a good one. I had a steady career, a comfortable home in the suburbs outside Chicago, and a wife I thought loved me. Looking back now, I realized the biggest mistakes in life rarely happen because we ignore obvious warnings. They happen because we explain them away. We convince ourselves that certain comments mean nothing. Certain silences mean nothing. Certain looks mean nothing. Until one day, everything suddenly means something. The evening that changed my life started like any other Thursday. Olivia was hosting a small dinner gathering for a few close friends. Nothing elaborate. Just wine, catered food, and the kind of conversations that drift between work gossip and old memories. I spent most of the evening grilling on the back patio while laughter floated through the open kitchen windows. The late summer air felt warm, carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass from neighboring yards. From where I stood, everything looked normal. Maybe that was the cruelest part. Disaster rarely announces itself. Around 8:30, I stepped inside to grab another tray from the kitchen. The house buzzed with conversation. Music played softly from a speaker in the living room. I could hear Olivia's voice somewhere down the hallway. I was about to head back outside when I realized I had forgotten the serving utensils. So I turned toward the pantry. That decision changed everything. As I walked past the partially open door to Olivia's home office, I heard someone mention a name I had not heard in years. Mark Reynolds. The name caught my attention immediately. Mark was Olivia's college boyfriend. The man she dated before we met. The man who moved across the country more than a decade ago. The man who occasionally appeared in stories about her younger years. Nothing unusual. Everyone has a past. I never felt threatened by it. At least not until that night. I stopped when I heard one of her friends ask, "Wait, Mark actually reached out?" Excitement immediately entered Olivia's voice. 3 days ago. Laughter followed. Then another friend said, "And what does Nathan think about all this?" The room erupted with amused chuckles. Something about the tone made my stomach tighten. I remained still beside the hallway wall. Olivia laughed too. Then she said the sentence that shattered 11 years of certainty. "Nathan does not know? Honestly, he is just a substitute. Once Mark is back for good, I will dump him." The world did not stop. People always say that when describing shocking moments. It is not true. The refrigerator continued humming. Music continued playing. Glasses clinked somewhere in the house. Life moved forward exactly as before. The only thing that stopped was me. I stood there frozen, staring at a family photo hanging across the hallway. Olivia and I smiling on a beach in Florida. Sunlight. Happiness. A moment that suddenly felt counterfeit. More laughter came from the office. One of her friends said, "You cannot be serious." Olivia answered immediately, "I am completely serious." There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no sign she was joking, just confidence. The confidence of someone finally saying what they truly believed. My chest felt strangely hollow. Not angry. Not yet. Just empty. Because in that moment, dozens of memories rearranged themselves inside my mind. The comparisons. The stories about Mark. The way her eyes sometimes drifted away when we talked about the future. Things I had ignored because love makes people generous with explanations. I quietly stepped away before anyone noticed me. Outside, the party continued. I smiled when people spoke to me. Refilled drinks. Cleared plates. Played the role I had been assigned without realizing it. The substitute. The backup plan. The safe choice while she waited for someone else. Around 10 o'clock, guests began leaving. Olivia kissed my cheek before heading upstairs. The gesture felt automatic, like muscle memory. I cleaned the kitchen alone and stared out the window into the darkness beyond the backyard fence. Somewhere in another part of the country, Mark Reynolds had sent a message. Somehow that single message had exposed a truth hidden inside my marriage for years. Then, just as I was about to turn off the lights, my phone vibrated on the counter. A social media notification appeared on the screen. Olivia had been tagged in a photograph posted less than 5 minutes earlier. I opened it. My pulse slowed instantly. Because standing beside Mark in the picture was not the man Olivia remembered. And what I noticed in that image made me realize the story she was telling herself was about to collide with reality. There is a strange kind of pain that comes from realizing you were never competing against another person. You were competing against a memory. I stared at the photograph for a long moment. Mark Reynolds stood outside what looked like a small airport terminal somewhere in Arizona. The image had been posted by an old college friend who happened to run into him. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it. But the longer I looked, the more details I noticed. His smile seemed forced. His clothes were neat but worn. More importantly, the confidence Olivia always associated with him was missing. This was not the larger-than-life figure she had spent years describing. This was a man who looked tired, human, ordinary. The photo alone did not prove anything, but it cracked something inside the fantasy she had built. I locked my phone and headed upstairs. Olivia was already in bed scrolling through messages. The glow from her screen illuminated her face in the darkness. For years, that face had been the first thing I wanted to see every morning and the last thing I wanted to see every night. Now I found myself studying it differently, looking for signs I had missed, looking for the version of her that had called me a substitute less than 2 hours earlier. "Everything okay?" she asked without looking up. "Yeah," I replied. The lie came easily, maybe too easily. She smiled and returned her attention to her phone. I wondered if she was messaging him. The thought sat quietly in my chest. Not sharp enough to wound, just heavy enough to stay. Sleep never really arrived that night. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself sitting alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee I barely touched. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I kept replaying the conversation from the office. Not because I doubted what I heard, because I was trying to understand how long she had felt that way. Weeks? Months? Years? Had I ever truly been her first choice? Or had I simply been the person who showed up after the man she actually wanted disappeared? By sunrise, I had reached one conclusion. I was not going to confront her. Not yet. Most people think immediate confrontation leads to truth. In my experience, it usually leads to better lies. If Olivia really believed Mark's return would change everything, then eventually she would show me exactly what that meant. All I had to do was watch. The next few days felt strangely normal. We ate dinner together, talked about work, watched television, smiled at neighbors. From the outside, nothing had changed. Yet every interaction carried a second meaning now. Every mention of the future, every casual comment, every unexplained smile when her phone buzzed. Then on Tuesday evening it happened. We were cleaning up after dinner when her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. She was in the laundry room and had left it behind. I had no intention of touching it. Then the screen flashed with a preview message. One name, Mark. My pulse slowed. The message was visible for only a few seconds. Long enough. Looking forward to seeing you. I hope things are different this time. The screen went dark. I stepped away immediately. A minute later, Olivia returned and picked up her phone. I watched her expression change. A smile appeared. Small, private, genuine. It was the kind of smile I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. That hurt more than the message itself, because it confirmed what I already feared. Mark was not just a memory anymore. He was becoming a possibility. Over the next week, his name appeared more often. Not directly, indirectly. Olivia seemed distracted, more energetic, more hopeful, like someone anticipating a long-awaited reunion. And every time she spoke about the future, I noticed she never included me in the picture. Then one Friday afternoon, while organizing paperwork in our home office, I discovered something I was never supposed to find. Buried inside an old folder was a printed email. The date on it was nearly 9 years old. The sender was Mark Reynolds. The recipient was Olivia. My hands froze as I read the first line, because suddenly I realized Mark had never truly disappeared from our marriage at all. The email was folded neatly inside a manila folder labeled Tax Records 2016. If I had not been searching for a warranty document, I never would have found it. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, evidence that it had been printed years ago and preserved for reasons I did not yet understand. My eyes moved to the first line. Olivia, I know you told me not to contact you again, but I need you to know I still think about you every day. The words seemed to pull all the air from the room. I sat down slowly in the office chair and continued reading. The message was not dramatic. There were no grand declarations or movie-style promises. In some ways, that made it worse. It was honest. Mark wrote about regrets, missed opportunities, mistakes he wished he could undo. He talked about wondering what their lives would have looked like if he had made different choices. The email ended with a sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. Maybe someday life will give us another chance. I looked at the date again. 9 years ago. For years after Olivia and I got married. For years after we exchanged vows. For years after she promised to build a future with me. My hands felt strangely numb. Not because of what Mark wrote. Because Olivia had kept it. Not accidentally. Not digitally buried somewhere among thousands of messages. She had printed it. Saved it. Protected it. That meant something. I carefully returned the email to the folder exactly where I found it. Then I closed the drawer and sat quietly for a long time. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the office carpet. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet everything felt different now. Looking back, I think that was the moment I stopped trying to save the version of my marriage that existed in my head. The next morning I made a decision. I was going to stop focusing on Olivia and start focusing on myself. Not out of anger. Out of necessity. For too long, my happiness had been tied to someone else's choices. If she wanted to chase a fantasy, I could not stop her. But I could decide what happened to me. So I threw myself into work. I had spent the last 7 years helping build a regional logistics company. Nothing glamorous. No private jets. No magazine covers. Just steady growth and long hours. 3 weeks earlier, my supervisor had mentioned an opportunity to lead a major expansion project. At the time, I barely paid attention. Now it felt different. I volunteered immediately. The project would require travel, leadership responsibilities, and potentially a promotion. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a sense of direction that had nothing to do with my marriage. Meanwhile, Olivia seemed to be living in a completely different reality. Her phone never left her side. She smiled more often, hummed while making coffee, spent extra time choosing outfits before work. Anyone watching from the outside might have assumed she was simply happy. Only I knew why. One evening, she casually mentioned that an old friend was coming back to Chicago. She said it while scrolling through her phone, pretending it was no big deal. Mark is moving back next month, she said. I nodded. Really? Yeah. Apparently, his consulting contract ended. She tried to sound indifferent. She failed. Excitement leaked through every word. I stirred my coffee and kept my expression neutral. That is interesting. She looked at me for a moment, almost as if she expected a stronger reaction. Then she smiled and changed the subject. That told me something too. She wanted freedom to be excited about his return without having to explain why. The following week passed quickly. My new project gained momentum. Meetings filled my calendar. Travel plans started taking shape. For the first time in a long while, I could see a future that did not revolve entirely around someone else's feelings. Then, late Friday afternoon, something happened that shifted everything again. I was leaving a meeting when my phone buzzed with a social media notification. An old college acquaintance had posted a group photograph from a welcome gathering downtown. Several familiar faces stood together raising glasses. Near the center was Mark Reynolds. I studied the image carefully. Then I zoomed in. My pulse slowed. Because standing beside him was not a successful consultant returning home after conquering the world. It was a man whose smile looked practiced, whose eyes looked exhausted, and whose expensive image suddenly seemed held together by something fragile. And judging by the comments appearing beneath the photo, I was not the only person beginning to notice. Nothing exposes the difference between memory and reality faster than a reunion. 2 weeks after the photograph appeared online, Mark Reynolds officially returned to Chicago. I knew because Olivia suddenly became impossible to read. She spent more time checking her phone. She smiled at messages she never shared. Some evenings she seemed distracted even while sitting directly across from me at dinner. It was like watching someone mentally live in 2 places at once. Part of her remained in our home. The other part had already traveled back to a version of herself from 15 years earlier. The strange thing was that I no longer felt the urge to compete with it. That surprised me. When all of this started, I expected jealousy, anger, maybe even desperation. Instead, I felt something quieter. Curiosity. I wanted to see what would happen when the fantasy finally met reality. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. One Thursday evening, Olivia mentioned she was meeting several old college friends downtown. Her tone was casual. Too casual. You should come if you want, she said while gathering her purse. The invitation sounded more like a formality than a genuine request. I smiled politely. I have work to finish. Relief flashed across her face before disappearing almost immediately. Most people would not have noticed it. I did. After she left, I returned to my laptop and spent the evening reviewing project reports for the company expansion I was leading. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed. A colleague had sent me an article about a regional distribution contract we were pursuing. I thanked him and opened the message. A few minutes later, while scrolling through notifications, I noticed something else. A public photograph from the restaurant where Olivia's group was meeting. Someone had tagged several attendees, including Mark. I hesitated before opening it. Then I clicked. There they were. 8 people gathered around a long table beneath warm restaurant lighting. Olivia sat 2 seats away from Mark. She was smiling. Not the polite smile she used with coworkers. The smile people wear when they are trying to reconnect with a version of themselves they miss. My eyes shifted toward Mark. And again, the same contradiction appeared. Olivia looked at him as though she were seeing a dream come back to life. But the man in the picture looked nothing like a dream. He looked tired. The comments underneath the photo were even more interesting. One former classmate wrote, "Great seeing everyone again. Hope things get better for you soon, Mark." Another replied with a supportive message about fresh starts. I read the exchange twice. Fresh starts. Better soon. The phrases seemed harmless until you noticed how many people used similar language. They sounded less like congratulations and more like encouragement. The next morning, I mentioned none of it. Olivia seemed unusually cheerful. She hummed while making coffee, talked about how wonderful it was reconnecting with old friends. Yet every time Mark's name appeared, her voice changed slightly. Softer, more invested. I simply listened. That weekend, something unexpected happened. I attended a business networking event in downtown Chicago. Hundreds of professionals filled a hotel conference center overlooking the river. During a break between sessions, I stepped into the lobby to answer an email. That was when I saw him, Mark Reynolds, standing alone near the coffee station. For a second, neither of us recognized the other. Then his expression shifted. "Nathan?" he asked. I nodded. "Mark." We shook hands. The encounter felt surprisingly normal. No hostility, no tension, just 2 men connected by circumstances neither fully controlled. Up close, the details were impossible to ignore. The expensive jacket looked slightly outdated. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His smile appeared practiced, like something worn repeatedly rather than naturally expressed. We exchanged small talk for a few minutes. Work, Chicago, the weather, ordinary subjects. Yet beneath every sentence I sensed something else. Fatigue. Not physical fatigue. The exhaustion of someone carrying problems they preferred not to discuss. Then another man approached him. "Mark, there you are." The newcomer's tone immediately changed the atmosphere. Mark's smile vanished for half a second. Just long enough. "I need to talk to you about the payment situation," the man said quietly. Mark quickly interrupted him and guided him away. But not before I heard those 4 words. Payment situation. As they disappeared into the crowd, a strange feeling settled over me. Because for the first time, I was no longer wondering whether Mark had changed. I was wondering what exactly he was trying so hard to hide. The more I focused on my own future, the clearer everyone else's choices became. After the networking event, I could not stop thinking about that brief exchange I had witnessed in the hotel lobby. Payment situation. The words themselves were harmless. People discuss payments every day. Businesses run on payments. Contracts depend on payments. Yet something about Mark's reaction stayed with me. It was not the conversation that mattered. It was the way he looked when it happened. For a split second, the confident image disappeared. In its place stood a man carrying pressure he could not completely hide. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a strange routine. My expansion project continued gaining momentum. What started as a regional initiative was now attracting attention from senior leadership. Meetings that once included 5 people now included 20. Conversations about growth became conversations about promotion. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about where my career was heading. The feeling was refreshing because it belonged entirely to me. It was not connected to Olivia. It was not dependent on anyone else's approval. It was mine. Meanwhile, Olivia seemed to be drifting further into the world she had imagined for herself. Mark's name appeared more frequently. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. She mentioned helping him reconnect with people in the city. She talked about introducing him to former colleagues. She even spent an entire Saturday afternoon showing him neighborhoods around Chicago because, according to her, he was considering where to live. I listened without comment. There was no point arguing with someone who was chasing an idea rather than a reality. One evening, I returned home earlier than expected after a client meeting ended ahead of schedule. As I entered the kitchen, I heard Olivia speaking on the phone in the dining room. She had not noticed me. Her voice sounded warm, encouraging. "Do not worry about it," she said. "I can help until things stabilize." I froze. A few seconds later, she continued. "You have done so much for me over the years." My stomach tightened slightly, not because of jealousy, because I knew exactly who she was talking to. When the call ended, I quietly stepped back outside and entered through the front door a minute later. She greeted me normally, smiled, asked about my day. I smiled back, but that conversation stayed with me. Help until things stabilize. The phrase echoed in my mind. A week later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. I was having lunch with an old college friend named Jason who worked in commercial finance. We had not seen each other in months. Our conversation started with sports, drifted into business, and eventually landed on mutual acquaintances. Then Jason casually mentioned a name I recognized. "You know Mark Reynolds, right?" he asked. I kept my expression neutral. "A little." "What?" Jason shrugged. "I met him through a restructuring case last year." My fork paused halfway to my plate. Restructuring? Financial stuff. Nothing illegal. Just a mess. Some investments went bad. A business partnership collapsed. From what I heard, he spent the last few years trying to recover. Jason took a sip of iced tea. Honestly, I felt bad for him. The conversation moved on, but my attention remained fixed on those words. Suddenly the photograph made more sense. The tired eyes, the strained smile, the comments about fresh starts, the private conversation at the hotel. Piece by piece, reality was replacing mythology. Yet Olivia seemed completely unaware. To her, Mark was still the man who left years ago, the man preserved in memory, not the man struggling in the present. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening, I came home to find Olivia sitting at the kitchen table reviewing documents. She quickly gathered them when she saw me. Too quickly. For a brief second, I noticed a bank statement with Mark's name visible near the top. She slipped it into a folder and forced a smile. My pulse slowed, because in that moment, I realized something important. Mark was not returning to rescue Olivia from the life she had. He was gradually becoming dependent on the very person who believed he was her escape. And the look on Olivia's face told me she had already started helping him far more than she wanted anyone to know. Success has a strange way of arriving when you finally stop chasing people who are determined to look somewhere else. The weeks that followed brought more change into my life than the previous 3 years combined. The expansion project I had volunteered for continued exceeding expectations. New contracts were signed. Distribution targets were met ahead of schedule. Senior leadership started inviting me into meetings that previously happened several levels above my position. At first, I assumed they simply wanted updates. Then one Monday morning, my supervisor closed his office door and offered me a promotion. The role came with significantly more responsibility, a substantial increase in compensation, and one unexpected detail. The position would eventually require relocating to Wisconsin to oversee a new regional headquarters. A few months earlier, the idea would have terrified me. Now it felt like an open door. I accepted immediately. As strange as it sounds, I did not tell Olivia right away. Not because I wanted to hide it, because I wanted something in my life that belonged entirely to me before someone else decided how they felt about it. Meanwhile, her connection with Mark seemed to deepen. They met for coffee, lunch, networking events, community gatherings. Every interaction was explained as harmless. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Yet when you stepped back and viewed the entire picture, a different story emerged. One evening, I came home to find Olivia sitting in the living room staring at her phone. She looked frustrated, not angry, concerned. The moment she noticed me, she locked the screen and forced a smile. "Long day?" I asked. Something like that. Her answer arrived too quickly. We ate dinner mostly in silence. Halfway through the meal, her phone buzzed again. I watched her expression change. Concern deepened. She excused herself and walked into the kitchen. Through the doorway, I heard fragments of conversation. "How much?" A pause. "That is a lot." Another pause. Then, "Let me think about it." When she returned, she pretended nothing had happened. I pretended to believe her. The next few days revealed even more. Olivia became increasingly distracted. Sometimes she stared out windows while lost in thought. Other times she seemed irritated by problems she would not explain. The excitement she carried when Mark first returned had started fading. In its place appeared something else. Stress. The transformation was subtle but impossible to miss. Then came Friday. I arrived home earlier than expected after a meeting cancellation. The house was quiet. Olivia's car sat in the driveway, but she was nowhere downstairs. As I walked toward the kitchen, voices drifted from the backyard patio through a partially open window. Olivia was outside. She was not alone. Mark's voice carried clearly through the afternoon air. I stopped without making a sound. "I just need a little more time," he said. "Everything is going to work out." Olivia sounded exhausted. "You said that 3 weeks ago." Silence followed. Then Mark spoke again. "I would not ask if I had another option." Another option. The phrase lingered. Something about it felt revealing. Olivia lowered her voice, but I still caught enough. "I already helped more than I planned to." My pulse slowed. Helped. Not planning to help. Not considering helping. Helped. Past tense. It confirmed what I had suspected for weeks. She had already given him something. Money. Support. Access. I did not know which. Perhaps all three. A chair scraped against concrete. Then Mark laughed softly. "You always take care of me." The words hit harder than either of them realized. Not because they were romantic. Because they exposed the dynamic beneath everything. Mark was not rescuing Olivia from an ordinary life. Olivia was rescuing Mark from the consequences of his own. A few minutes later, I quietly left through the front door and drove away before either of them knew I had been home. That evening I sat alone beside Lake Michigan watching waves roll against the shoreline. The wind carried the first hints of autumn. For the first time since this began, I felt completely calm. Because reality was finally moving faster than fantasy. And as the sun disappeared below the horizon, my phone vibrated with an email from corporate leadership confirming my relocation package had been approved. What Olivia did not know was that my future was already beginning to move in a direction where she no longer occupied the center of it. There comes a moment when reality becomes too heavy for fantasy to carry. By the middle of October, that moment had finally arrived. I could see it every time Olivia walked through the front door. The excitement that had once surrounded Mark was gone. The energy. The anticipation, the hopeful smile she used to hide whenever his name appeared on her phone. All of it had been replaced by exhaustion. She still met with him occasionally, but the meetings no longer seemed to make her happy. Instead, they seemed to leave her carrying invisible weight. Meanwhile, my own life continued moving forward. The relocation plans were finalized. The new position officially became public inside the company. Colleagues congratulated me. Senior executives invited me to strategy meetings. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was stepping into a future I had earned rather than inherited. The difference was difficult to describe. Confidence built through effort feels different from confidence borrowed through someone else's approval. One evening, I arrived home to find Olivia sitting alone in the living room. The television was on, but she was not watching it. She stared at a blank spot on the wall as though lost somewhere far away. When I walked in, she looked startled. "Everything okay?" I asked. For a second, it seemed like she wanted to answer honestly. Then she shook her head and forced a smile. "Just tired." I nodded. Months earlier, I would have pressed for more. Now I simply accepted the answer she chose to give. Later that week, the truth began revealing itself in ways neither of us expected. It started with a mutual friend named Rebecca. She and Olivia had known each other since college. While attending a networking event downtown, I happened to run into her near the registration desk. We exchanged small talk before the conversation unexpectedly shifted. "I feel bad for Olivia," Rebecca said. The comment caught me off guard. "Why?" She hesitated. "Never mind." Then she sighed. "I probably should not say anything." Those words guaranteed I would remember every word that followed. Rebecca explained that several people within their old social circle had recently become concerned about Mark. Apparently, he had been telling different stories to different people. One version involved a business opportunity. Another involved temporary financial setbacks. Another involved plans that never seemed to move forward. The details changed depending on the audience. The pattern remained the same. People were starting to notice. As I drove home that evening, I found myself thinking about something Jason had told me weeks earlier. Bad investments, failed partnerships, financial struggles. Every new piece of information seemed to point in the same direction. Yet Olivia still appeared determined to believe the best version of him. 2 days later, everything shifted. I came home from work and immediately sensed something was wrong. The house felt unusually quiet. Olivia sat at the kitchen table staring at her laptop. Her eyes looked red, not from crying, from disappointment. There is a difference. She did not notice me enter. On the screen was an email. I only caught a glimpse before she closed it, but it was enough. Mark's name sat at the top of the message chain. She looked up slowly. Nathan. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. I waited. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, "Have you ever realized someone is not who you thought they were?" The question hung in the air between us. The irony almost hurt. I could have answered in 100 different ways. Instead, I simply said, "Sometimes." She looked down at the table. In that moment, I knew something important had happened. Maybe not everything. Maybe not enough. But the image she had spent years protecting was finally beginning to crack. That night, after she went upstairs, I remained in the kitchen reviewing relocation paperwork. A thick envelope rested beside my laptop. Inside was everything needed to begin my transfer. Housing information, employment agreements, timelines. One signature remained. I stared at the documents for several minutes before placing them back into the envelope. Then I noticed something across the room. Olivia's purse sat partially open on a chair. A folded piece of paper protruded from the top. I normally would have ignored it. But one word visible on the page caught my attention immediately. Divorce. For several seconds, I simply stared at the word. Divorce. It was visible through the folded edge of the document sticking out from Olivia's purse. The kitchen remained silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. I could have walked over and looked at it. I could have unfolded the paper and answered every question immediately. Instead, I stayed where I was. Because something told me the details mattered less than what the document represented. Months earlier, Olivia had been planning a future that did not include me. Now she was carrying paperwork that suggested she might finally be confronting the consequences of that future. I went upstairs without touching it. That night's sleep came easier than I expected. Not because I felt happy, because uncertainty had finally started disappearing. For the first time in a long while, reality was becoming visible. The next morning, Olivia seemed unusually quiet. She barely touched her breakfast. Her phone remained face down on the table. Another change. There had been a time when she checked it every few minutes. Now it sat untouched beside her coffee mug. "You seem distracted," I said. She looked at me and managed a weak smile. "Just thinking." I nodded and left it there. The drive to work felt peaceful. Autumn colors had begun spreading across northern Illinois. Trees along the highway glowed with shades of gold and red. Sometimes life chooses strange moments to remind you that seasons always change whether you are ready or not. By lunchtime, I received another update regarding my transfer. Housing options near the new regional headquarters had been finalized. The company wanted my decision within 2 weeks. I spent most of the afternoon reviewing neighborhoods, schools, restaurants, and local amenities. The more I looked, the more real it felt. A fresh start. A new chapter. A future built around possibilities instead of disappointments. When I arrived home that evening, Olivia was sitting alone on the back patio. A blanket rested across her lap despite the mild temperature. She stared into the backyard without moving. The sight immediately reminded me of someone watching a dream disappear. I stepped outside and took the chair across from her. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you believe people can spend years loving an idea instead of a person?" The question caught me off guard. Not because of what she asked, because of how she asked it. There was no defensiveness in her voice. No arrogance. Only regret. I thought carefully before answering. "I think people sometimes remember who someone was and forget to notice who they became." She looked down at her hands. The reaction told me everything. Whatever illusion she had been holding on to was collapsing. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Over the following week, the distance between fantasy and reality continued widening. Mark called less frequently. When he did call, conversations often ended with frustration. Olivia tried hiding it, but she was never particularly good at hiding disappointment. One evening, I overheard part of a conversation from the living room. "That is not what you told me before," she said quietly. A long pause followed. Then another. Finally, she replied, "I do not think I can keep doing this." The line went silent. She ended the call. For the first time since this entire situation began, I felt genuinely sad for her. Not because she had hurt me, Because watching someone realize they built years of hope on the wrong foundation is heartbreaking no matter who they are. 3 days later, I returned home to find the folded document sitting openly on the kitchen table. No longer hidden inside a purse. No longer tucked away. Beside it sat a handwritten note with my name on the front. Nathan. My pulse slowed. I placed my briefcase on the floor and walked toward the table. The house was empty. Olivia was not home. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the envelope like a spotlight. For several seconds, I simply stood there looking at it. Then I picked it up and opened the note. The first sentence immediately changed everything. Because instead of asking me to leave, Olivia was asking if we could talk before either of us made a decision we could never take back. The conversation happened 2 nights later. By then, the autumn air had turned colder, and the trees outside our neighborhood had nearly finished changing colors. Olivia sat across from me at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals over the years. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different from the silence we had lived with during the previous months. This one was honest. There were no distractions left, no illusions, no imaginary future waiting somewhere on the horizon. Finally, Olivia slid the document across the table. It was not a completed divorce filing. It was a consultation packet from an attorney. Information, questions, options. The kind of paperwork people gather when they no longer know what direction their life is heading. I thought this was what I wanted, she said quietly. Her voice sounded tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally exhausted. For years I convinced myself that if Mark ever came back, everything would make sense. I listened without interrupting. She looked down at her hands. But I was not waiting for a person. I was waiting for a memory. The words hung in the air between us. For the first time since this began, she was seeing the situation clearly. Not through nostalgia. Not through fantasy. Through reality. She told me everything. The financial problems. The requests for help. The excuses that kept changing. The promises that never materialized. Piece by piece, the image she had protected for years had fallen apart. What hurt her most was not discovering who Mark had become. It was realizing how much of herself she had sacrificed chasing someone who no longer existed. When she finished speaking, the room fell silent again. Why did you never tell me? She finally asked. I knew exactly what she meant. Why did I never tell her I heard the conversation in the office? Why did I never confront her? Why did I never fight harder? I looked out the window before answering. Because I realized something important, I said. If someone has to be convinced to choose you, they never really chose you in the first place. Tears appeared in her eyes. Not dramatic tears, just the quiet kind that arrive when truth finally settles in. We talked for hours that night. About mistakes, expectations, regrets. About all the small moments that slowly pushed us apart. There was no shouting, no blame, no villains. Just 2 people acknowledging the damage caused by years of unspoken disappointment. In the end, we reached a decision together. Our marriage had changed too much to return to what it once was. Some bridges can be repaired. Others can only be remembered. A month later, I relocated to Wisconsin and began my new position. The transition was easier than I expected. The work challenged me. The new city felt welcoming. Most importantly, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Peace. Real peace. Not the temporary comfort that comes from avoiding difficult truths. The deeper kind that comes from finally accepting them. Olivia and I remained respectful toward each other. Occasionally we exchanged messages about practical matters. Nothing more. Life moved forward. 6 months later, I returned to Chicago for a business conference. On my final afternoon in the city, I stopped at a small coffee shop overlooking the river. As I sat near the window, I noticed a familiar figure walking along the sidewalk outside. Olivia. She looked different. Lighter somehow. Not because everything had worked out perfectly. Because she had finally stopped chasing the past. For a brief moment, our eyes met through the glass. We exchanged small smiles. Then she continued walking. So did I. And that was enough. Looking back now, I do not think this story was ever really about Mark. It was about what happens when people confuse memory with reality. It was about learning that self-respect matters more than being someone's backup plan. Most of all, it was about understanding that the right future cannot be built on the wrong fantasy. As I finished my coffee and watched the river move through the heart of the city, I realized I no longer felt angry. I no longer felt betrayed. I simply felt grateful for the lesson. Sometimes losing the life you expected is the first step toward finding the life you actually deserve. Before the story ends, I would genuinely leave.